Hello and welcome to the webinar. We are excited to have you here as part of the Pathlock Innovation Series today. Our session right now is Do More with Less While Reducing Risk, How Automated Workflows Can Revolutionize Your PeopleSoft Systems. Our presenter today is Greg Wendt, Executive Director of Security Solutions.
Perfect. Thanks, Stephanie. So as she said, my name is Greg Wendt. I'm an executive director here. Just a little bit about me. I do go back with PeopleSoft and ERP systems many years. So I started back in '97 with oil and gas, worked in retail, worked in higher ed. When we talk about workflows and onboarding and rolling out events, way back in the day, I rolled out self-service remotely on a PeopleSoft 7 platform with 45,000 employees around the US. So it's something that I've been doing and working on for a really long time. Inside of higher ed, obviously, you deal with a lot of different student onboarding and how are you going to keep them involved? How do you get them inside of your security model when you're onboarding maybe tens of thousands of different students come spring or fall type of scenario. So that's just a little bit about me. Now I wanted to level set real quick, just give you a little bit of background on Pathlock, and then we'll jump into the session. So Pathlock really leverages integrations to provide a 360-degree view of risk across your application set. You'll see a little bit of that today, actually, with the demo when we jump into that. But it really allows you to see cross-application. So not just within your PeopleSoft or a system like that, you can actually see what they have in Active Directory, PeopleSoft, or maybe even Salesforce or SAP or anything like that. It really gives you a consolidated look and feel as to what the risks are. You pull those in, match them against an SOD rule set, and you can leverage that for authorizations, user access reviews, all sorts of things like that. So that's one of the real advantages of what we can do here at Pathlock, is not just integrate with some of the things that we're talking about today with the joiner, mover, lever process. We've also got the ability to really quantify the risk across all of your application sets. Pathlock really is a market-leading unified access orchestration platform. You can see some of our customers that we work with, as well as some of our partners. So with that, let's just go ahead and start talking about the topic at hand today. So when you think about how organizations have changed versus where they were versus where they are today. It used to be, especially when you're talking about access to an ERP system, for example, everybody was on-prem inside the firewall. There were a lot of controls in place. And I mean, I think this was actually true even all the way up to COVID a couple of years ago. I know, sure, there's some applications that they've poked a hole in the firewall for and those types of things. But when you're really talking about holistic, real large access to some of the systems, some organizations really didn't have external access. So there's a lot of disjointed manual processes that are involved in this, and it's really pushing a lot of pressure across the organization for whether it's compliance requirements, access, really just getting things done in a faster period of time. Like those onboard, many organizations are going through what we call the digital transformation right now. What does that mean? What does it look like? What are we going to do with all of that? How are we changing our apps? It's extending the apps. It's changing them. Are you getting rid of your core ERPs? Most likely, no. You're probably not going to do that. Will you extend maybe some functionality that's needed with some best of breed web, cloud applications? Probably, and then you're just going to integrate back to your ERP system. So the integrations, the connections, the authorizations. It's going to become more of a challenge just because of all those communication, because of the core critical apps that everybody's attempting to touch into. So, and then you've got issues with audits and fine-grained access and compliance mandates that are going on, whether it's data security or security for, dealing with governmental issues, security issues, any of those types of things. So today has really changed. It moves at a faster rate. People have access to more. They have access to more and more applications remotely outside of the firewalls, as well as on different devices. It used to be that everything was very controlled. It was on a delivered laptop or controlled access point that they gave you, and now that's not the case anymore. So lots of additional pressures coming in, and really it starts with common access management challenges. Manual and time-consuming user onboarding and offboarding. We'll kind of go into that a little bit more as time goes by with this. And then PeopleSoft specifically doesn't necessarily natively talk to a SAML integration. So when you're thinking about how do we integrate with this with Azure or ADFS or Okta, Ping, insert whatever identity provider you want to at that particular point, PeopleSoft doesn't do that. So how are we going to work with that? How do we get it within our normal environment to where there's the same controls that we have to access, especially when you're talking about, from a compliance perspective, you need to provide MFA into that particular system because it has access to PII and sensitive information and sensitive transactions. So it really requires an MFA to be able to access that particular system. So additionally, many people are involved in an access process. It could be the requester. How is that going to be started? Where is it going to come from? Who is going to have to approve it? What all needs to get provisioned for that particular user before they're even able to do anything? And typically it's going to end up just everybody okaying it. We're just going to rubber stamp it, copy this particular user, do whatever thing they had before. They're going to be acting like Jimmy, so just give them Jimmy's access regardless of what Jimmy has. Well, that opens you up to a lot of risks, a lot of concerns. And in PeopleSoft, there is no centralized platform to manage the access and the roles across multiple applications. People can change things in the development and test systems that they probably can't in production. Typically, the development and test systems are a full copy of production as well. So you are not limiting data, and you have that same sensitive information in the dev systems as you do in the production system. So it becomes a real challenge to be able to support that model moving forward. So those are some of the real issues that we're dealing with. Some of the other manual processes that are always been a constraint is how much effort is needed to enforce SOD. How many people are actually enforcing SOD within a PeopleSoft system? Sure, you're probably using your roles and permission list to try to maintain that as much as possible, but it's very difficult to understand who changed what, who worked with what, who looked at what. Just because of the way PeopleSoft logs are generated and how they're tracked like that. How much effort is needed to maintain clean and coherent roles. That's another challenge. Talking to organizations at different conferences and things like that, there's definitely a different maturity life cycle as to who does what when it comes to, let's say, user access reviews and keeping clean their roles. I've heard everything from, an organization will have a new role that's built and defined for every individual user, which is mass chaos in my point of view, just because you are going to have so many different roles that it's almost impossible to keep up with them. And how, there's zero reuse in that scenario. And then there's some that just have roles that are all inclusive of everything. And it becomes very difficult to try to take out what's not needed in that role. So lots of different challenges around that. And then how much effort is required to provision a user, and how are you going to provision that user? This is really, what we're talking about today is that joiner, mover, leaver process. And it comes down to people, processes, and technology, and all of those must work together. And the technology really must enable the former. It's got to be used in a way that's cohesive and specific and repeatable. Something that allows you to create a process flow that's going to, let's say, onboard or take a lever out of the organization. So there's definitely some different thoughts of process as to how that can happen and why you might want to do things different ways. And we'll go into a lot of that as we're talking through that today. So also, when you're looking at some of the risks, challenges with that, you can kind of see them on the screen. Typically a lot of your risk is going to be defined when your third parties come in or your internal auditors are looking at things. I dealt with the auditors for 20 plus years, so it is something that's a challenge. And it's also very siloed between those applications. There is no real cross application look and controls in place. So when you're even inside the PeopleSoft environment, let's say you're running financials and HCM, it's very difficult to know what that user may have in HCM that they have in financials, and does that build a risk because of what they have from the access points between the two? Because some of those teams don't even necessarily talk to each other. They don't necessarily share the user access reviews. They're done by different business owners completely. And a lot of that's driven by manual spreadsheets. When we talk about the provisioning process as a whole, that's something that I'll talk about in a little bit of, but it really boils down to, how to have a repeatable process and get out of that spreadsheet driven world. It seems that's where so much information is tracked within a lot of these ERP systems as a whole, of, whether it's a UAR or whatever, everything. Well, we exported everything to spreadsheets and we shipped them over. It's very difficult to work with those. They can become very daunting. And then how do you work with sample testing when you're talking about the risks? So the life cycle and the maturity model is very different across many organizations. So what our goal is to really help you manage those risks, but also take you further through the maturity life cycle that we'll get in and understand today. So managing risks in PeopleSoft is really critical. Whether it's an untimely security audit or hopefully not, in an example of maybe a breach, that's typically when most organizations find out that their setups and controls weren't efficient enough or not correct, is when they actually end up having a breach. And why do they have that, or what was the end cause of that? It could be anything on the list here. Also, the flip side is inefficient SOD conflicts, the monitoring processes, understanding the risks around those types of process flows inside of the application, manual provisioning and deprovisioning. A lot of organizations end up with breaches or access after somebody has left the organization, especially if they've got access to maybe a shared account as well, because it's difficult to change those passwords, but deprovisioning a user and getting them out of your organization in a timely manner is extremely important, as well as onboarding them with the correct rights. And really, it's about managing that workflow and that process. And there's also complex internal controls and checks and balances as to what needs to take place. And the audit reports are challenging. It's difficult to understand, maybe even user creations and offboarding, deprovisioning, because so much of it is done manually and through emails and things like that. So the increasing regulatory compliance mandates are always going to be a challenge. Those aren't going anywhere. It's going to probably increase the audits because of that. For an example, I talked to somebody about user access reviews and they weren't doing them enough. And they kept getting dinged on them with an external audit, for example, that now they're forced to have to do them monthly, where that's something they should have been able to do every quarter or maybe every 6 months. They're now forced into a different mandate on that process. So when we talk about taking that a step further, into how do you really simplify the PeopleSoft Access Governance with automation? What's the goal of the automation? How are we going to do it? What's the real advantage of it? There's a couple of different ways, and we talked about this from the life cycle perspective. So I'm gonna kind of high level this slide a little bit, because it's really about key different areas. One, how do I access, or how do I manage those access requests? What am I going to do with them? How are they going to be approved? How are they going to be authorized? Am I going to have anything that's systematically done that's just generating and giving access to people? Because that's important as well when you're talking about automation. There's a real difference there between how can I automate core access that's really bulletproof, and it's at a level to where it's just allowing them to do the functions that they need to do. And we'll talk about that from the perspective of like an employee. So many times when you're talking about giving access to somebody, we want to give them 100% of what they need to be able to do their job function. I like to break that down a little bit first. When we talk about automation, how can I bring and onboard an employee or a student or somebody like that, for example, and give them their core base least privileged access? Because I want that to be consistent, because they have a core role first. If I'm bringing in a new employee, they're still an employee first. They have to be able to do benefits. They have to be able to do payroll, all of that type of stuff. That's core. Then they have to be able to do their job. So that's additional access. So at that particular point, normally that's going to involve higher privileged access. and it's going to have a particular approval at that point. So that's, to me, an additional access request. You don't want to try to automate that 100% because you're trying to bite off more than you need to. You want to come up and develop the core base, then you add additional access, and then you remove that access, and then that alleviates a lot of your pains around that joiner, mover, leaver process. So when you're looking at that user lifecycle management, you can really cut down on what the types of workflows, how deep you need to go with those workflows, and those types of situations. So the important part is also tying into your SODs and understanding when you're allowing somebody to go through or giving them additional access, what is that doing? Am I giving them or creating additional SOD risks or increased risks by giving them additional access? And that's why it's important to be able to understand the SOD rule sets and what that user might gain access to. And then on the user access reviews, it's the same type thing. All of this is really a life cycle that's continuing and improving all through time. So the user access reviews, a lot of that is they're difficult to manage. They're difficult to deal with, and nobody wants to work with them. How do I do them cross-application? They're typically managed in a spreadsheet, and somebody's going through and doing all of those things. Are there any sort of automation around removing roles and authorizations automatically on an approval or a denial? So that's where you can really pick up a lot of time and effort and automation, as well as around those user access reviews. And then emergency access. Emergency access is always something that can challenge an organization, because you're talking about that break glass situation, or how am I going to give somebody access to the most privileged system and be able to do everything in it, and then be able to track what they're doing. So emergency access is very key to all of this. And it really boils down to, here at Pathlock, we really allow you to automate your entire access and governance life cycle. It's going to strengthen your security model, and it's going to leverage and give you the ability to be compliant. When I talk about the onboarding, it's going to be compliant onboarding. It's going to be compliant access requests. Why? Because we're going to tie that in with the different risks, and we're going to understand that, and we can let you know that up front before you actually give this additional access to somebody. So if we can tell you during a additional access request that somebody's going to be able to do a SOD violation, it's probably going to cause a red flag. And it's going to say, well, maybe I don't want to give this person that access. Maybe I do need to create a different role at this particular point. It lets you know up front you are creating a risk for your organization. So when we look at those user onboarding, it's really about the account creation and automating that process as much as possible, but it's streamlining the events in a way to make them to where they're quantifiable and repeatable. Role design will definitely need to be taken into effect, because you've got to design your roles in a way thinking about least privileged. How can I break these into a way that's manageable to where I can bite them off in chunks and automate that process? I'm going to automate those workflows to be able to do as much as I possibly can do in that system without having to get into that approval request. So whether that's onboarding of a student or onboarding of an employee, for example, I'm going to give them their base functionality to do what they need to do. I shouldn't have to think about that. I should be able to do it quickly, efficiently, and repetitively, over and over and over with the system. And that's what we're talking about. And then we're going to leverage that access governance, because it's going to be able to help us through that process of understanding, do they have any sort of SOD audits? Or the compliant provisioning is happening. So when we're looking at the user access reviews, if 90% of our workforce or our students are all staying within those same base roles, we probably don't have to do a lot of user access reviews. Why? Because we designed that role up front. We're applying it to them consistently. We're doing it compliantly, and we're not going to have a challenge with that. There's no changes because there's less human interaction, and the system is just taking care of it and automating the entire process for us. Now, when we get into the changes of those access requests for additional access, that's where we want to bring in our rule set and make sure that we're not creating additional risks. And then obviously from the high privilege users, we're going to need to validate the user access requests on a periodic basis, whether that's every quarter, every 6 months. That can be completely automated and delivered to the users that it's important for. Excuse me. And then we get into identity and data security. And this is really leveraging the attribute-based access controls that we can bring within the PeopleSoft system. We can tie into SAML SSO, so we can turnkey and create the account in Active Directory, create all the accounts in PeopleSoft, tie all that together, and they can seamlessly log in with SSO right away. So completely changes the whole paradigm shift of maybe taking 2 to 3 days to get somebody into the system. You can have it done in probably less than an hour, to where it's easily done. Everything's created with a consistent manner and just fires off and does what it needs to do. You also need to leverage dynamic MFA and data masking inside of a compliant system and a secure system, because you're going to have to protect the data that people are accessing. So automatically bring in roles and authorizations and policies that are going to define and protect that data based upon who's accessing what, where they're coming from, all of those types of stuff. And then have the threat detection and alerting. What are users doing? What are they accessing? Are they accessing anything that they're not supposed to? All of those types of things. So you can see not only are we automated the workflows, but we're going to secure the user access as well and give you accountability and auditability on this entire process flow. So it really helps through that entire life cycle to make sure that it's compliant and secure. So let's go ahead and jump into a demo here real quick. So I'm going to flip my screen over here. And I am not shocked that the PeopleSoft session expired. So I'm going to sign into a campus solution system. Working on this with a couple of different customers right now. So I've got a working demo on this. So what I'm going to do is really go into the business processes within the PeopleSoft system. So I'm going to go into maintain applications, and I am going to find a user here that is in an application state that will work for me, and then I will be able to convert them. Let's open up that page. What I'm looking for is the program data. All right, so they're active, they've been matricked. So let's find somebody who, that one's already been matricked. All right. Lots of different rows. All right, so this particular person is admitted. So I'm going to grab their employee ID here, and something I want to do real quick is I'm just going to do a new window. And what I want to do is look to see if this particular user already has an operator ID. So I'm going to go out to the user profiles real quick, put that in, and they don't have a user profile. So they don't have anything already built and defined within security. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a new row, and I'm going to matric this particular student. This is kind of the process flow that we worked with a couple of different universities on. If you're familiar with this, it's basically the same thing as onboarding an employee. We're hiring an employee. So in this point, we're hiring a student or bringing them in as a student. So I'm going to go ahead and matric them. And what's occurring is it is now moving them over to where they're now owned by student records. So admissions really has nothing to do with them from the business process. So I'm going to flip back over to our Pathlock cloud system and talk a little bit about the automation. First off, let's talk a little bit about the workflow itself. So I want to manage the steps. So the workflow, what it's going to do is it's going to systematically find this. So I'm going to run a process, and what we're doing with that process is we're going to synchronize data between the Pathlock cloud system and the PeopleSoft system. So what's going to occur is once that process is run, it's going to start, it's going to create the user account, it's going to add authorizations, and then it's going to finish. So from the end user's perspective, this is completely a lights out process. There's no approval process involved with this particular flow, and that's where it really comes down to what we're going to do. So if I look at the parameters here, something that we're doing through those roles is we actually are applying this business role of a PS student. So I'm going to show you what that business role looks like. So this ties back to setting up and configuring what those business roles are. So the business roles that we've designed and developed are really about controlling access for this student. So it sets up to where I can call out and look at this and say, hey, I'm going to give this particular student in this workflow all of the different authorizations that are within this role. That's where it's consistent. There's 875 activities. We've got 7 different roles that this particular, student is going to have. We can drill in and see the individual activities. This is going to be the component page that they have access to. From an audit perspective, has there been any, changes to this particular role or any of those types of things? No. So this is what we're doing. So this allows that consistent, this is what a student looks like, or this is what an onboard of a student or an employee looks like. It allows us to drill in and have something that's least privileged access in a format that is consistent. So now the system needs to go out and define when that's going to occur. So what we do in that scenario is we're going to synchronize the organizational structure. So within the Pathlock cloud system, and I kind of talked about this, we have the ability to store information about the users. So when we onboard the student or an employee, basically there's an event that's occurred within the system. So at that point, they're either hired, or in this situation with the students, they're going to be matric. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to synchronize the organizational structure. And what it's going to do is go out, look at the PeopleSoft system, and it's going to tell me that if there's any changes in the system. So it's actually going out, connecting to the PeopleSoft system, looking for data changes within the process flow to see when that occurs. So it syncs that data, and it's going to allow me to understand that this process flow can continue and refresh and actually, go and build out. So let me look at that real quick. Let me look at the log. That ran a little bit faster than I figured it would, but let's actually go look here. Yeah, I don't think that actually worked correctly. Hold on just 2 seconds. Because from a process flow, what it should have done, and I think I'm having a connection issue with my system here, is it should have actually gone out and created the entire account and moved through that process. So I need to do something here real quick. Actually, going to restart that process real quick, and we will rerun that. So I have too much stuff running on one of my servers. ahead and run this again. Okay, so as you can see now, we're actually receiving the data from the system. So it's communicating out to the PeopleSoft Campus Solutions system, and what it's doing is synchronizing that data structure between those two. So this is where it's going to find that new student in this scenario, and it's going to go through and allow us to see. So now that it's succeeded from the perspective of finishing that entire process flow. So the workflow would have then been kicked off and initiated because it's entirely systematically done at that point. So if I come out here and search, all right, what is that one? So, all right, let's run that. Let's see, let's look at the workflows and, all right, so let's do the view the request. No, that's not what I wanted to view. Let's go back to the workflows or the org sync here. So that was running. So the workflow is going to kick off, and I'm going to grab somebody that I've already done before, just kind of not sure why this isn't connecting when it's wanting to at the moment. So as we can see from an access perspective, the employees, I'm going to go ahead and pull open some of these accounts that are already within the system. So if I look at all of these accounts, we're going to be able to see, for the example of the onboarding event. So I'm going to open up the user profile, and I'll show you this one and how it was created within the PeopleSoft system. So we've got an audit of what was created and how it was done. So this particular user, the ADF L user, I'll go over here and open this up real quick. And you can see that we're setting everything inside. So you can see inside of the Pathlock cloud system the different roles that the user has. So we're going to see all of the different roles that that user was granted, as well as understanding what those authorizations are, how the activities are, and all that other type of stuff. So it really goes ahead and allows us to track those individual users and what they have access to in the system. This kind of gives you a way to understand maybe an ad hoc user access review in the system as well. So it allows you to see, currently what does a user have. So if I were to look at any of these user profiles, we can see what type of roles this particular user has. So in this scenario, we can see they've got those same 7 roles. So it's kind of like an ad hoc user access review is one of the things that I like to look at it as well. But it really, you can see there's also no risks. The risks that those are tied to is it's dealing with the risks that are built in from the SOD rule set and how those access points are coming in. But the process would go off, fire, and create all of the different, all of the necessary authorizations within the PeopleSoft system. So we can see it created the different rows. They've got all the access here. And then all of the different roles matching what was created on the flip side of setup coming from that workflow with the business roles that are built and defined. So we're going to end up with those 7 different roles. The users are going to end up with very consistent authorizations and approvals at that particular point. So really from an accessibility perspective, that allows us to turnkey all of those different events within the system. From the onboarding, it allows you to set up what are these users going to look like when I onboard them. And that's where it becomes really important through that joiner, mover, leaver process. And we'll talk about it from kind of a theoretical perspective at this point is, what we want is least privileged access. We only want them to be able to do self-service style events or whatever we define should be done when we onboard an employee or a student. So, now this person can go out, they can enroll in classes. If it's an employee, they're going to be able to do benefits, HR, payroll, those types of things. Maybe they'll even have access to financials to do expenses. There's lots of orgs that do that as well. So that really, narrows down, what the onboarding event is. And the difference is there's no approvals for that particular process flow. That's how narrow I like to set it, to where this is the baseline. Why? Because if there's an approval step that's needed, then that's going to, slow down the process. It's no longer going to be able to systematically run and just onboard this particular user. Because as I was kind of talking about earlier, we can create the Active Directory account, we can make changes there, whatever's required, so you can get that user onboarded within your systems that you need inside of your application set very quickly. And also house them within your SSO, for example. So, if we create the Active Directory account, they can tie in with ADFS, sign into the PeopleSoft system, and quickly have access to whatever they need to do. And then you come in with the joiner, mover, leaver process of adding additional authorizations that go through approvals. Those approvals will allow you to grant whatever authorizations they need for that worker or student at that particular point. And those will have to go through an approval step depending upon your organization. I've talked to some people the other day that, they wanted it to go up to the CISO from the perspective if they had access to PII level 1. So not only was it a security administrator or a business administrator that had to approve the access, it went all the way up to this CISO if they had certain access inside of the PeopleSoft system. So if it had PII, he wanted to be able to approve it, or she wanted to be able to approve it, whatever. Basically there's multiple steps in that approval process flow. And then when you're talking about the offboarding, at that particular point, there's many different environments out there as to how you're going to offboard. Many times, if you're providing W-2s or tax-related information or payroll, any of those types of things, you can't really remove 100% of somebody's access. And that's where you can bring them back down to this base access point of having the ability to enforce that least privileged access again. So depending upon how you want or how you need to control the offboarding process, at some orgs, you're just going to cut off all access completely, which is totally fine. But at other organizations, if you are doing things that allow, enforce you to contain or still to provide access moving forward for a period of time, that's where you can bring them back to this base access, because this doesn't give them any or allow them to do anything outside of the normal controls that they would have for self-service style access anyway. So it really allows you to go through that onboarding and offboarding in a consistent manner, in a repeatable manner. So based upon events that occur within the system at that particular point. So it really cleans up a lot of the workflows and can make them far more targeted and far less challenging when you're talking about the onboarding, offboarding, and really the maintenance of those particular workflows as well. So I'm going to flip back over to the PowerPoint here real quick. And as you can see, this is really going to be a cost-effective solution that's tailored to meet the needs of your business, because the onboarding event is going to be defined by you. What we're going to do is go look within the PeopleSoft system to tie that event out. So it's going to be something that's very targeted and built upon your, I'm going to air quote, the joiner process to allow you to automate that particular access at that least privileged access. So whatever the event is that you're utilizing to onboard, whether that's a hire, whether that's a student, it's going to be consistent. It can be completely automated, and it can be systematically generated within the entire workflow process. So it's just going to fire and go ahead and do it. Keeping in mind when you're talking about, that simplified access of that least privileged is you're going to have less approvals to be able to grant that access. So it's going to be able to handle, really that 80% for you. It's going to be able to do all of those process flows, get it, done, and then you're going to be able to compliantly provision that user with the correct workflows and approvals when you're talking about adding in additional authorizations moving forward. So the other side of it, it also allows you to manage RBAC and attribute-based access controls very differently as well. So obviously, we were talking about role-based access inside of these systems. You know, when you're layering in the fact of our security controls that you can put into place there as well, it gives you that ability to mask and protect data, integrate with single sign-on. So it really it allows you to leverage all of the different security controls that you can put into place at that point, and how you want your end users to be able to work with the system, access the system, and what type of data they should be able to work with. So it is going to increase your security model moving forward. One, because it's a repetitive process as well. That's one of the advantages of the workflows in automation. You want the automation to make you more secure and more consistent in how things are applied to your systems. And then also, it's going to simplify the user access reviews. I didn't really go over that. The session wasn't really on a lot of the access reviews, but it is something when you're talking about how are we going to manage those, what are we going to do with them, how are we going to work with those. It's more along the flows of, you know, from a user access review, we call those a campaign. You can ship the review over to either like a business user or their direct line manager, but it's completely automated, systematically done based upon a timeline and an interval that you can set up with basically run controls, just like within the PeopleSoft system, for example. So really a lot of efficiency gains around that. The nice part about it is when you're using like the Pathlock cloud system for the compliant provisioning, is you're going to have all of that auditability all within one location anyway. So it's going to make the auditability or the audits and, you know, dealing with the UARs much easier, because you're going to be able to go to one location to be able to track and understand what's affected that particular account. You can see, you know, at the account level, you know, what workflow has touched and worked with that individual account. You can see the details of that individual workflow, so you can track it. And the nice part is the auditors can have full access to all of that system as well. So that's really where it becomes very important. And it's going to really allow you to control your SOD rule sets and prevent fraud, because it's going to allow you to understand, as I was kind of saying earlier, through the additional access requests, you're going to be able to understand what authorizations are going to be given to a user. You're going to be able to see them up front. You're going to understand what your risk profile is if you do grant this additional access to that user, and if you need to put any sort of mitigations or other risks in place before that happens. So, you know, really a cost-effective solution on a delivery model of how we can really maintain all of your different workflows and how those are accessed across the system moving forward. So with that, I wanted to say thank you and really open it up for Q&A. So as Stephanie said earlier, you can submit questions on the GoToWebinar control panel. It's typically on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any questions, you can submit them there, and we can cover off on those now real quick.
Thanks, Greg, for that presentation. Yeah, if you do have any questions, please add them now into the questions box. And while we wait for any questions, I just wanted to encourage you to look at the chat. I put in the chat that our next session coming up here in just a few minutes is a holistic approach to your IT security within SAP. I put the link to that there. If that interests you, I encourage you to register for that. We also have more sessions coming up throughout the day, and I put a link in the chat to our full agenda. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, so if you do have any questions, please email us at info@pathlock.com, and we would be happy to answer any of those. And with that, I'll just say thank you, and we hope to see you at future sessions.